it's a material now because Trump even said he doesn't want to broker anymore. He said that he made a comment about how only the two sides, only they know all the details. They can work it out for themselves. What he's saying is we're not going to be involved anymore.
So the idea that the U.S. is going to completely disengage from the war in Ukraine is certainly music to the ears of dissidents, and that's exactly what Aaron Maté thinks, and he was on Judge Napolitano's podcast specifying as to why he believes that to be the case, even though the Trump administration has continued to supply Zelensky with arms. Let's get a load of this one. I can't wait. Let's watch and react. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel.
What is your take on the telephone call and the aftermath between Presidents Trump and Putin on Monday?
Well, it looks like Trump is finally making a decision when it comes to the Ukraine proxy war, and he's walking away. He basically said that if the two sides can't come to a deal, then that's their problem, and they'll have to work it out for themselves, and only they can work it out. And what he's saying is he's done with the war. And I've said all along that Trump is not going to go back to Congress and ask for a reauthorization of tens of billions of dollars more for the proxy war. So I do think he's leaving Ukraine and the rest of NATO that are still behind this proxy war on their own. Now, there is one caveat, though, because what if Europe can come up with the money to buy the U.S. weaponry that Ukraine needs? I don't think that's likely because it's a lot of money that Europe doesn't really have right now. But what if they can? Will Trump be willing to sell that weaponry to NATO? I think he actually would, because he loves to see deals. He loves to make deals. He loves to make money for the military-industrial complex. So with that possibility open, that Trump might still continue to arm Ukraine as long as other people pay for it, aside from that, in terms of providing the U.S. funding for the war, the U.S. leadership for the war, that was the Biden policy. I do see Trump walking away from that.
This is interesting because there's been several ebbs and flows in the U.S.-Zelensky relationship since Trump took office again, most famously culminating in that episode where Zelensky waltzed into the White House, acted like he was entitled to the U.S. Treasury, and Trump scorned him and said, "You don't hold the cards, you're gambling with millions of lives," and it looked like he was going to break connections with Zelensky. We all know how that turned out. He restored much of the military intelligence and the aid after that. But hey, I hope Maté is right here and that Trump is now willing to walk away from this, as is Witkoff. He has always seemed to be, in fact. But Trump deciding this would be a huge, huge benefit. But the idea that there could be kind of a proxy war inception, a second layer proxy war by actually selling the weapons to Europe, which are then given to Ukraine to fight the Russians instead, it really makes things status quo as far as the Russians and Ukrainians are concerned. But I just want the U.S. to get out of it, stop enriching the military-industrial complex. It's not worth it, and it still embroils animosities amongst Russia, which really the U.S. should just have good relations with and trade with. They're a nuclear power, and this is not the Soviet Union anymore.
Does anybody take seriously his protestations? He said it as recently as Tuesday, when he was answering questions about the phone call on Monday. It's not my war. It's not my war. It's not my war. It is his war. It's his war because he's the president of the United States and he's funding it. It's his war because during his first term, he substantially and materially armed Ukraine. That was the basis for, it was inappropriate, but it was still the basis for the impeachment.
I'm a little bit more generous to him on this question than you are, Judge. Yes, he was largely responsible for. Yes, he carries responsibility for this war. In his first term, as you said, he carried out policies that prolonged this war. He did nothing to support the Minsk Accords. He tore up the INF Treaty, which was a major source of tension between Russia and the U.S. It helped plunge arms control to historic lows. The INF Treaty had limited and reduced the weapon stockpiles that the U.S. and Russia can use to threaten each other. And Trump withdrew from that at the behest of John Bolton. That's one of the issues that Russia wanted to address in its draft treaty that it submitted to the U.S. and NATO before it invaded Ukraine in February 2022. But on the other hand, after Russia invaded, it was the Joe Biden administration that sabotaged the peace talks that Russia and Ukraine entered into, reaching the outline of a peace deal in Istanbul in April 2022. It was Joe Biden that prolonged the war. It was Joe Biden who made the decision that he wanted to use Ukraine to bleed Russia. So in terms of that part of the war, that is not Trump's war. And I do see Trump now doing what Joe Biden refused to do, which is talk to Russia and talk about ending this war. And so I do give him credit there. It's better than what Joe Biden was doing. It's better
Well,
than what.
So Aaron is a little bit more generous to the Trump administration than I would be too, and I've heard similar things being said by Jeffrey Sachs. On the other side is Douglas McGregor and John Mearsheimer, who have been more critical toward Trump on these points because he campaigned as if he would end, involvement or create a peace to this war within the first 24 hours. Now, a lot of people recognize that as empty rhetoric at the time, but his whole voting base, the entire electorate essentially that backed him, does not support endless funds toward Ukraine, endless militarization, and drawing us into this proxy war and escalating it when there's already inflation issues and debt issues, and we're sitting here asking for this big, beautiful bill in Congress right now, which will result in 20 billion, or as Massey thinks, 30 billion more in debt at this point. So I hope Maté is right and that Trump decides to walk away from it. Like him, I can't see Trump going back to Congress and actually demanding more money at this point. But if he is truly sick and tired of negotiating and just wants to walk away, I'm totally good with that. That's a better result than tying yourself into these negotiations while you're a belligerent, while you're spending all the money anyway.
Kamala Harris was offering as well.
He seems to, in furtherance to your argument, he seems to have dropped the demand of ceasefire first, negotiations later. A demand that we know is contrary to Russian history and contrary to the way the Russians do business. So perhaps he came to that conclusion either from something Witkoff said to him or from his 2-hour conversation with President Putin, because he and Rubio seem to have dropped that, Secretary of State Rubio seemed to have dropped that absurd demand.
I think what happened there was, Zelensky and Macron and Keir Starmer were so desperate for something that could make them look tough. They got together, they came up with this, ultimatum that Russia, unless it agrees to a 30-day ceasefire, it's going to face new sanctions. And they kind of ambushed Trump, and Trump, probably without much thought, said, yeah, sure, okay, why not? Like, let's do that. But then Trump talked to Putin, and he realized from Putin that Putin doesn't care, that Putin doesn't care about these ultimatums. And Russia will continue to impose its demands on Ukraine, including Ukrainian neutrality, by force.
And by the way, part of the plan between Macron and Mares was, let's have cocaine, but hide it quickly before the cameras come in from the corporate media, if you recall that too.
And so I think Trump made a comparison between what the U.S. and their allies are capable of in terms of can they stop Russia from achieving its goals, and what Russia's determined to do. As many guests have talked about with you over the past week, in Istanbul, the Russians relayed the message that, listen, like, we fought these wars before. We're prepared to make this go on for a very long time. So I think Trump took stock of that and realized.
Yeah, they basically did that in Afghanistan for about 10 years. So for a decade, they fought the Afghanis with less overall success than you see from them today in the Donbass. But that is true. Russia is, to some extent, conditioned to accept this. I mean, it's despicable whenever you see any world power engaging in such long-lasting wars, but it is the case that Russia has precedent to suggest they are willing to do this. At least they have at some parts in their history, and their cultural leanings are probably aimed at that direction.
That the only way he could really enforce the ultimatums would be to double down on military support for Ukraine, which he doesn't want to do.
But
so
under Trump,
that's why he caved pretty quickly and basically abandoned the ultimatum that he had signed on to.
And that's good anyways, because the Russian desires for a ceasefire, the preconditions that Putin himself laid out when he was interviewed about this, were essentially the same preconditions that he had laid out for an overall peace and end to the war. So there wasn't really much point to this gambit of ceasefire anymore from the U.S. perspective and trying to secure that as an aim. So I'm glad the Trump administration has essentially walked away from that, or at least isn't invoking the ceasefire idea anymore.
Under Trump, we remain a co-belligerent. We're still picking targets for them. We're still giving them military equipment, and we're still giving them intel.
Yeah, that's true. But that's going to run out eventually, the weaponry, the money for the weaponry will run out eventually. And
You
what
know,
happens
we I wish we knew how much money is left. I have a little smirk on my face because nobody knows, because the Defense Department doesn't reveal these numbers, doesn't keep accurate numbers, hasn't passed an audit in 8 years.
Well, we know that Joe Biden, every 6 months or so had to go back to Congress and ask for more money. And it's true that the last time he got money was a bit over a year ago. That was $60 billion. It's a lot of money. At the same time, Ukraine's losing a lot of people. They're blowing through a lot of ammunition very, very
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah, some projections have Ukrainians having over 1 million people dead at this point from this war. It's hard to know what exactly the true figures are. I've seen figures across the board, but Douglas McGregor believes that it might be as much as 1.5 million people have died in this war, and a few 100,000 on the Russian side. I think the Russians do want to, they don't want this war to go several years. And the Ukrainians, despite the rhetoric of Zelensky, don't want that either. Zelensky is being held to continue in this war from right-leaning nationalist forces, including the Azov Regiment, which are neo-Nazis, by the way, to push forward. But at some point, it just becomes unacceptable, especially when it doesn't seem like it will be even imaginable for Ukraine to take back Donetsk and Luhansk at all. And if they continue fighting, they might lose Odessa too. So that's another matter that is worth considering here.
I think
I would give it months. I would give it months.
they must be concentrating on drones because they can't produce the manpower to win on the ground.
No, they certainly can't. And that's why the images you continue to see in terms of how they're generating manpower is kidnapping people off the streets.
But isn't it laughable that a co-belligerent could also be a mediator? How can we mediate between Ukraine and Russia when we're funding Ukraine?
Well, given that it's U.S. weaponry and intelligence that sustains the war, the U.S. can use this leverage over Ukraine to bring the war to an end. And also, simply, if it walks away, then the war has to come to an end, unless Ukraine and Europe can find another way to come up with the money and the weaponry, which I don't think they will. So, the U.S. role in brokering the talks to me is it's a material now, because Trump even said he doesn't want to broker anymore. He said that he made a comment about how only the two sides, only they know all the details. They can work it out for themselves. What he's saying is we're not going to be involved anymore.
I think that's the biggest point that Napolitano made there, is that in the corporate media you hear, especially Trump's base talking about, well, Trump is going to negotiate an end to this war. And that's what is being reported on our corporate media, right? But from the Russian perspective, the U.S. is simply just an enemy, and they're the real enemy to Russia. It's not Ukraine. Everyone knows that Ukraine is just a piece on the chessboard of the West and the U.S. desire and quest for empire building. That's what Ukraine has been used for. Of course, there have been forces within Ukraine, especially Zelensky, that have been complicit with that, rejecting the initial Istanbul peace offer, which some accounts have being almost completely solidified before Boris Johnson and probably the State Department and the Biden administration talked him out of. But we are a belligerent to the Russians, so for us to put ourselves in this, impartial umpire, this arbiter that's going to create peace there, it just seems retarded. It seems unimaginable and impossible, untenable and unrealistic. So Aaron's right about this, and Napolitano's right about this.
Do you think that Witkoff is not going to be negotiating with President Putin anymore over this? He may be negotiating with him over other things, but over the war.
Well, Witkoff certainly has his hands full. He's handling the Iran portfolio. He's handling the Gaza-Israel portfolio. So for the sake of maybe getting a deal, it would be good if someone else took it over, because how can he possibly achieve anything on all these different tracks if he's handling all of them at the same time? So I don't know. But certainly, if I were Witkoff, I would pick one lane and stick to it, because it's just impossible to handle
You
all of
have
these.
Yeah, Aaron might be right about that. And Witkoff, in my estimation, is one of the best members of the Trump administration. I think he genuinely does want peace in Ukraine and complete uninvolvement from the U.S. perspective. And, you know, if they have to replace him on the Ukraine side, that is actually kind of terrifying to me, unless you put someone like Adam Bowler in there, who was equally desirous of making amends with Russia and getting out of these entangling proxy wars with nuclear powers. But listening to Aaron in general makes me white-pilled about the whole Ukraine thing, because I sure have been a little bit more cynical than him about the chances of this war to wind down soon. I've been more optimistic about that in the last 2 days than I have since the beginning of the Trump administration, though. And just from the optics and what these people are saying, the ceasefire now seems to be off the table, and some of the rhetoric does seem to indicate, and the actions that kind of mirror it, that the U.S. is finally willing to walk away from this. Now, I'm very apprehensive about what Aaron said earlier in this broadcast when he said, well, a possibility exists for this to be a proxy of a proxy, where the Europeans would pledge all this money, but they'd actually follow through with those pledges, which they always talk about now. And then the U.S., with Trump's permission, will actually just sell Europe the weapons to give to Ukraine to fight against the Russians. The same thing that's essentially happening now. You could have this war lasting several more years. And don't get me wrong, that would be better than what's happening now from the U.S. perspective, from an America First perspective, where the U.S. is more directly involved, but we're still lining the pockets of the military-industrial complex, creating all these twisted incentives that just lead to catastrophe. They've led the U.S. to be empire builders and not have a military for defensive purposes, more for hegemony and empire, and that's not what we want. But I do want to hear from you guys in the comments below. Do you think Aaron Maté is right? Do you agree with him on this, that the Trump administration is simply going to walk away from Ukraine shortly? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.